So someone recently asked me how many chord shapes are there on the mandolin, which is a valid question because once you get past those easy open chords and you get your hands around the chop shapes, what's next? And that's a bit of an overwhelming topic, right? Because I don't know if you were like me when I was first starting out, but I didn't know any better but to buy a big book of mandolin chords like this with dizzying fretboards full of chord names I couldn't even pronounce or read, and I just didn't know where to start. And if you're getting into jazz or swing or more complex styles of music like that, you're playing seventh chords or adding extensions and all sorts of crazy things like that, you might need a book like that for reference, right? But for folk or bluegrass music, how many shapes are we gonna use? And after graduating with a Bachelor's of Science in Mandolin Music Performance and touring full-time on the road with several professional bands and now teaching full-time, beyond the open chords and the chop chords, I can confidently say that I pretty much only use 3 shapes to play major and minor chords. Just 3. And in this video, I want to show you how to play those 3 shapes and some variations of these shapes for all 12 major and minor chords up and down the neck. But we're not just going to stop there because I also want to give you some practical application here. We're going to go over some exercises about how to practice these, how to get more familiar with the shapes, and then we're going to take these shapes and play them over a tune that you might know, so that way you can start playing some music with these chord shapes right from the start. So whenever you're ready, grab your mandolin and let's dive in. All right, but before we get started playing these chords, there's an amazing mandolin player that you need to know about first. The incredible jazz mandolinist Jethro Burns. Jethro was one of the first mandolinists to ever delve into the jazz and swing idiom with our instrument, and throughout the 40s, the 50s, and 60s, he played as a part of a comedic duo that played swing music called Homer and Jethro that you may have heard of. And that duo was so influential to a lot of progressive mandolin players that we know and love today, like Sam Bush, Don Sternberg, David Grisman, folks like that. And I mentioned Jethro here because many folks credit him as being the first mandolin player to really pioneer these chord shapes that we're going to look at here. So much so that some people refer to these 3 chord shapes as the Jethro shapes. And not to say that these shapes are only useful in a jazz or swing setting, because Jethro was also a great bluegrass mandolin player, and he and other players of his generation, like Roland White for instance, they used these shapes instead of a bluegrass chop chord in some settings, so who's to say that we can't? So anyways, I definitely recommend that you check out some of Jethro's music as you dig into these shapes. I'll drop a link in the description below. So that being said, let's take a stab at learning some of these shapes, but we need to establish a few prerequisites, I think is the word. Is that how you say it? We need to establish a few prerequisites. And to start with, let's get a little music theory jargon out of the way here. And you might already know this, but your basic major and minor chords are a combination of 3 different notes, right? And those 3 notes together are often referred to as a triad. And those 3 different notes in your triad are often labeled individually as the root, which is the letter name of the chord that you're playing, right? Then you have the 3rd and the 5th above it, and those are some terms that we'll be using a bit in this video here. But for our purposes here, we won't really be getting into how we build these chords theoretically. That being said, it is helpful when you're working with these shapes to know the note names of the root, the 3rd, and the 5th for all of your major and minor triads. So if you're not familiar with that, check this out. Here are all the spellings for all 12 of those major and minor chords. Feel free to write this out on your end, or you can head over to my Patreon page at the link in the cards above to download a PDF copy of this, as well as PDFs for all the chord charts and diagrams that we're going to be looking at here in this video. All right, prerequisite number 2 is figuring out how to deal with 3-string chord voicings on the mandolin, because Jethro shapes start out with just 3 notes. Granted, some people play some 4-string variations of these same chords where they add in an extra root or an extra 5th, and we'll get into that later, but I think it's really helpful to start with the 3-note voicings. Also, these 3-string shapes have all 3 notes of your triad built in, so you don't need to add any extra notes to make these sound really rich and full. Also, this is just the way that Jethro used to play them a lot, so you have that as well. The only challenge is figuring out how to mute that extra set of strings, right? Which brings us to our 3rd point, which is that we're going to be playing all these chords in closed position with the exact same fingering every time. Because of the beautiful symmetry of the mandolin here, that means that we can play the exact same shape up and down the neck to get whatever desired chord that we want. You can even play these shapes on the higher D, A, and E strings, right? But the challenge is when you're playing these shapes on the higher strings, it's a little bit hard not to hit that open G string, and it's hard to mute the G string, and I think it's a lot easier to play on the lower strings and mute the E string. So that's what we'll be doing for this video. All the voicings we're going to look at are right here on the G, D, and A. All right, well, I've teased you long enough, and it's actually time to start learning these shapes now, I promise. But some of these shapes might actually be familiar here at the start, like this A major chord here. If you know your A major triad, you know we have A as our root, C sharp is our third, and E is our fifth. And I like to call this shape right here root position because A, our root, is the lowest note in this chord shape here on the 2nd fret of the G string. Then the other notes, we have C sharp here on the 4th fret of the A string. We have E on the 2nd fret of the D string to make our full triad. And some of you folks might already be playing the 4-note variation of this chord where you add the 5th fret up on your E string to get an extra root, which is totally fine. We're gonna get to that later though, and for now, let's see if we can limit ourselves to the 3-note voicing just on the G, the D, and the A string, and then see if you can mute the E string with the fleshy part of your index finger like that. That way you can strum through all 4 sets of strings without worrying about an unwanted open string sound. And like we mentioned earlier, since we're not using any open strings and this is a closed position shape, we can move it up and down to find whatever other major chord that we want to as well. And obviously we could just start with our A major chord here as a reference point and count up to B flat, to B, to C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E. But that's kind of long and tedious, and I think there's a much more efficient way to do this. Instead of thinking about all 3 notes of the chord at once and thinking about it as a unit that you have to move up from a reference point, I think it's much simpler just to think about 1 note within the chord, in particular thinking about the root note of this chord and where it happens in this shape. And for this root position shape, that's easy, right? Because it happens on our index finger on the G string. And that's really the ticket to being able to easily use this chord shape for whatever major chord that I want to play, right? All I have to do is remember to find the root on the G string with my index finger. So for instance, if I want to play a C major chord with this shape, all I have to do is find the C note here on the 5th fret of my G string with the index finger. And then I can easily build this shape around that note. And that's the chord. Same thing if I want to play like an E flat chord, for instance. I can find the E flat with my index here on the 8th fret of the G string and easily make this shape around it to get that E flat major chord. And by the way, if you're still getting used to those note names up and down the fretboard, be sure to check out this other lesson video that I made on that very topic up here in the cards above. Could be useful as we keep going through this lesson here. All right, but let's come back to A major for a second. So we have this root position shape that we learned, but there's actually 2 other shapes that we can use for this exact same chord. The next shape is up here on the 6th, the 7th, and the 7th frets of your G, D, and A strings. I call this our first inversion shape because it's the exact same 3 notes that you had for your other A major chord. We're just inverting the order that they appear in register. So now instead of the root being the lowest note of our shape, here we have the 3rd of the chord, which is C sharp. Then we have our root, our A on the D string, and then E, the 5th of the chord here, is on our A string. And just a note about the fingering of this chord shape, some people like to bar down with their middle finger across the D and the A strings, which is totally fine. I just always feel kind of weird about hyperextending this knuckle, and it feels more comfortable for me to squeeze in 3 fingers like this, but I have pretty narrow fingers, so you have to do whatever works best for your hands. So try it both ways, see what feels the easiest, see what sounds the best too, and go with your gut. But always want to make sure that we're muting the E string here. So see if you can use your free pinky or use the fleshy part of your index again to mute that E string. And either way you choose to finger it, the most important thing about this shape is to remember that your root is now on your middle finger on the D string. And if you remember that, you can use the same rule of thumb to use this shape for other major chords up and down the neck, right? So here A is on my middle finger on the D string, but if I want to use this same shape to play, say, an E major chord, all I have to do is come back to the 2nd fret on my D string, which is an E note, and then I can build this shape around it really easily. Or say I want to play an F sharp chord, I can find this F sharp here on the 4th fret of the D string, and play this shape around it. But back to A major one more time, we got another shape to learn, right? So we have root position, we have first inversion, and then the last chord shape is what I call second inversion, way up here on the 9th, 11th, and 12th frets of your G, D, and A. Again, same 3 notes for your A major chord, but again, we're inverting the register of these notes. So here, the lowest note of this chord is your 5th. It's an E note here on the 9th fret of your G string. Then we have the 3rd on the 11th fret of your D string. And then lastly, we have the root on your ring finger up there on the 12th fret of the A. And another note about the fingerings for this chord shape here is that I know some people like to use their ring finger and their pinky on the D and the A strings, but I actually like to use my middle finger and my ring finger for a couple reasons. One, it just feels a little bit more comfortable to me, but also I like to keep my fingers on the same strings as my fingerings for the previous inversion. So if I'm coming from this shape, the first inversion of our A chord, I've got my middle finger on the D, my ring finger on the A, and it feels a lot easier to keep my fingers on those same strings and shift up to this instead of having to lift my fingers up and place them down with new fingerings like this. But try both ways and see what you think. So you probably know the drill by now, but you can use this same shape to play other major chords. Just keep in mind that your root is now up on your A string with your ring finger. So if I want to play a D major chord with this shape, all I have to do is find the D note here on my 5th fret of my A string, build this shape around it. Or say an F major chord. What about F up here on the 8th fret of my A string? Same shape, another major chord. There you go, those are our 3 shapes, congratulations. But now, of course, we have to go and learn these same 3 shapes for all the 11 other major chords out there, so buckle up. And since you already know how these chord shapes work, let me just show you how to play the Jethro shapes for all 12 major chords, starting with the lowest possible shape up to the highest. Just keep in mind, where are those roots for each one of these shapes, because that's gonna be your anchor to come back to later on. And one other thing to keep in mind is that we're not always gonna be starting with the root position chord like we did for A major. Sometimes we don't have a low root to start with on the G string. So for D major here, we're gonna start with our second inversion since our D happens here on the 5th fret of our A string to start with. And again, you can always download those PDF copies of the chord and fretboard diagrams over on Patreon at the link above if you wanna follow along at your own speed, but let's check these out. All right, those are all the major chords, right? But we still have minor to go yet. But you probably already know that we've already done the heavy lifting here, because to make a major chord into a minor chord, you only have to change one note. If you lower the third of a major triad by 1 fret, you turn that major chord into a minor chord. So I guess technically we're kind of having to learn 3 new shapes for the minor versions of these chords, but I think they're so tied to the framework of those major chords that I can lump them together in my mind. Plus, 6 chords isn't quite as clickbaity as 3 chords on that title of this video, so we're sticking to it. So let's come back to our root position A chord and see how this works. To make this A major into an A minor, all we have to do is lower the third of our chord, which is C sharp here on the A string, down to C natural to get our A minor root position chord. Same idea with our first inversion shape here. This is our A major here on 6, 7, and 7. Now we just find the C sharp, the third of our chord, which happens to be on the G string here for this shape, right? And we just lower it by 1 fret to create our A minor chord again. And lastly, our second inversion shape here. This is our A major again, and to make this into A minor, we find our C sharp, our third, here on our D string on our middle finger. Lower that by 1 fret, keep your other notes the same, and you've got another A minor. That's not too bad, right? Hopefully you can see how these major and minor chords are so similar in nature, right? We're just changing one note, but otherwise all the other notes stay the same. Also, a really helpful thing is that the root note stays on the exact same finger on the exact same string from major to minor as well, so you can use that root note again as kind of a guide to find these same shapes for other minor chords. And let's do just that. Let's see if we can play these 3 Jethro shapes for the minor chords for all 12 minor chords around the horn. Well done. That is quite a lot of chord shapes that we went through there, and it takes a long time for these shapes to, I don't know, digest and to get familiar, so take your time as you're going through all these. But I do want to give you some practical exercises and way of going about using these that will help get these even more in your fingers. And here's the first thing that I'd recommend doing is just seeing if you can play these 3 Jethro shapes for a chord in time up and down the neck. So for instance, here on our A major chord again, what if you did 1 measure on your root position, then 1 measure on your first inversion, 1 measure on your second inversion, and then back down. Just doing downstrokes with your right hand is a good place to start. That way you're not doing anything too complex and you can focus on what's going on with your left hand. And you can do the same thing with all the other chords individually, right? Just start with the lowest possible chord inversion, work your way back up and back down. But eventually what would be even better is to see if you can play through all 12 major chords together in progression, which is a lot harder but really useful because it trains us how to go from one triad to the next using these shapes here. So let me show you how this works. It's the same idea as before where we're starting out here on the A major chord, doing 1 measure per shape as we go up the neck. On our way back down though, instead of ending up on the root position, let's shift to the next chord on the circle of fourths, which is D major. Go up these shapes. Next up would be G major, right? And back down. Now it's C major. Now onto F major. Next would be B flat. E flat now. Down to A flat. Then we have D flat major. F sharp, then B major, and lastly we have E major. Before ending back at A where we started. That's a lot of work. And of course, you can do the exact same exercise around the circle of fourths with your minor chord shapes too. So let's try that out while we're here as well. Starting off with your A minor Jethro shapes. Next up is D minor. Now G minor. Then we have C minor. Next up would be F minor. Now B flat minor. Next up is D sharp minor. G sharp minor. C sharp minor. Now F sharp minor. B minor. And E minor. Before we get back down to your A minor at the end. Next, let's see how we can use these Jethro shapes in a real chord progression. I don't know if you saw our recent lesson on the tune Blackberry Blossom, but that's a great tune that has a lot of chords. That's really good to try these shapes out on. Check out that lesson in the cards above if you want to review the chord progression and the melody for this tune. And here's what I'd recommend doing with a tune like this. See if you can play through the whole chord progression using only Jethro shapes in a certain position. In other words, we're going to pick our home bass. For our tune here, we're in the key of G, so let's start with this G chord here on the 4th, 5th, and 5th frets of the G, D, and A strings. Then we're gonna pick chords that are as close by to this G chord as possible. So the next chord would be a D major, and we can keep our ring finger on that A string on the 5th fret and play this D chord really close by. Our next chord would be C major, up here, root position C shape, before coming back down to the G that we started on. Then some repeated chords, we have C, G, then we have our A chord down here on 2, 2, and 4 before coming back to our D chord. Then that chord progression basically repeats, right? G, D, C, G, C, G, D, back to G. Here, let me play those chords in time for you. And for the B section, we're introducing a minor shape, right? For E minor, how about we use this shape right here? And then we go to a B chord, really close by right here, before coming back to our E minor chord. Then we have C, G, D, G. And just seeing how those chords link up here in this general territory is going to be really helpful to see how these shapes intertwine, but we have a couple other territories to explore as well. Next, let's see if we can come up to the second inversion of our G major chord here on the 7th, 9th, and 10th frets, and use this as our home base to find other chord shapes for those chord progressions as well. So we start off with this G chord here, then our close by D major chord would be root position right here, before shifting up to first inversion C, back to G. C, G, then we have first inversion A, back to root position D. Here's what that new A section sounds like in time in this higher position. Onto that B section, we have our root position E minor here. And then we have our first inversion B that's really close by. Then back to E minor before going to C, G, D, back to G as well. If you want to be thorough, you can play all those chord shapes way up the neck too, starting with root position G right here. If this is our starting place, our close by D chord would be first inversion right here. Then we have second inversion C, root position G. Then our close by A chord would be right here, second inversion, before coming up to first inversion D. Same idea on the back end. All right, it's really high up here, but let's see if we can play this A section in time. Onto your B section now. We have first inversion E minor, then we have second inversion B, back to first inversion E minor. Then we have C, G, D, and G. And here's that B section. once you get familiar with all those territories individually, thinking about each root chord being your home base, you can start weaving in between those territories as you go through the chord progression, and you might end up playing something like this. And hopefully when you get to this point in the video, you can kind of taste and see the excitement of all the possibilities you have with these shapes. You can combine them together in any order that you want to and find ways of getting up and down the neck and, I don't know, make accompaniment more exciting and more engaging and involved as you play through the tune. All right, so you've learned all these chords up and down the neck. You've even figured out how to play these shapes for a chord progression, but we still haven't talked much about how to use these shapes in a bluegrass setting, right? So let's pause for a second and talk about that. I think about these chord shapes as being kind of the middle ground between the sustained open chords and the muted chop chords, right? When you play this chord inversion for your A, you can either let the strings ring out and sustain like this, or you can choke the strings to get kind of a quasi chop sound. And by knowing these shapes, we're just giving ourselves an extra option to draw from when the time comes. When I'm at that jam, I'm always trying to look around to the other mandolin players and see what they're doing for accompaniment. If there's another mandolin player chopping with these chop shapes, I probably don't want to double what they're doing and just kind of muddy up the rhythm. I probably don't want to just play open chords too if there's another mandolin player playing open chords. So a third option would be to play these shapes. That way I'm adding to the jam instead of just doubling another part. And there's so many right hand possibilities for these chords as well. I know we've mostly been sticking to down strums here to keep things simple while we're learning these shapes, but feel free to add in any strum pattern that you want to. You could even add in some cross picking ideas if you want to. All sorts of things. We've come such a long way in this video so far, but we're not even done yet, because here in the chord appendix, I'm going to show you some common 4-note variations of these Jethro shapes that you can use. And if there's any stragglers that have actually made it this far into the video, how about a shameless plug here just for good measure? All those likes and subscribes here on YouTube go quite a long way, so thank you. But let's learn these 4-note chords. Starting out with that root position shape, right? Remember our A major root position, 3-note voicing here. Like I mentioned earlier, you can add in the 5th fret on your E string with your pinky to add in that extra high root to fill out this sound even more. Same with your root position minor chord, right? Here's the 3-note voicing. You can just add in that high root again on your E string and voila, you've got a 4-note voicing. And again, these shapes are closed positions, so even with that high note on top, you can move them around to any major chord that you want to, and you're gonna get a big fat 4-note sound. The next 4-note voicing, here the first inversion, you can add in your pinky on the 9th fret of your E string here to add in an extra 3rd for your chord. This is one I don't really like using quite as much because it's a bit of a faux pas to have 2/3 of a chord in the same voicing, but in a pinch, this'll do. Same idea with your minor chord shape, right? Now we just have 2/3 to lower, one here on the 5th fret of your G string, one here on the 8th fret of your E string to get this new A minor 4-note voicing. Next, shifting up here to your second inversion of your A chord, you can add in the 4th note on your E string here on the 12th fret, adding in an extra 5th to get a fuller sound if you want to. Same idea for your minor chord, just lower your 3rd and keep that high E string in the same place. And one more bonus voicing that's kind of related here. It's a little bit different though, because we're going to start off with our root position shape on the D, A, and E strings here. This is the 7th, 7th, and 9th frets of your D, A, and E to get your root position A chord. And then we're going to add in an extra note here on the 9th fret of your G string with your middle finger. Now we're adding in an extra 5th of the chord, which sounds pretty nice. This is a really useful shape that I like to use quite a lot. And then you can make this into a minor shape just by bringing your middle finger to the 8th fret of the E string and then moving your ring finger to the 9th fret of that G string. Another good shape to use. So on your own time, see if you can find those 4-note voicings for all 3 of those Jethro shapes. I guess kind of all 4 if you had that bonus one in, for all 12 major and all 12 minor chords. I'll leave it up to you. Well, there you go. Those are the 3/maybe 10 or so chord shapes that'll totally change your life forever. I know there's quite a lot packed in there, and it takes a while to digest all this stuff, so take your time as you're going through this material. But eventually, all these chord shapes are going to be as familiar as your open G chord is now. So I'm excited for you. If you like this video, if you learned something from it, again, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. And if you want to support the channel, join us over on Patreon and get access to all those extra learning resources. So until then, I'll see you in the next video.